In our last video, we installed the Sharp's DS2 inference analyzer on a fresh server. We walked through the installation of all of its component projects, DS2 data scripts, naive Bayes predicate, random forest predicate, and the inference analyzer, as well as the provisioning of a new server and the installation of the prerequisites, including the Glassfish web application server. In this video, we're going to build on that work, and we're going to install the CCD redaction via web service with probabilistic rules. That means we're going to install the Predicate-Reducer, the CDA web service, and the CDA Predicate-Reducer web app. We've already provisioned a host, and we've already installed quite a bit of software on that host. So if you haven't seen the prior video, you might want to watch that first. We're logged into the host as the user DS2 user. So what we're going to do first is we're going to install the Predicate-Reducer. Predicate-Reducer, if we scroll down, the project page is down here. We can access the Bitbucket repository in a new browser tab here. And we can jump to the installation instructions, build from source code. The first step is to install a naive Bayes predicate, which we've already done. And then the second step is the version control step to actually pull down the Predicate-Reducer project and source code. So we're going to do that. That's going to take just a minute because there's a lot of files in there. So we can look at the next step while we're waiting. The next step is to edit a properties file to set some log file destinations. We're going to go ahead and do that. We're using the VI editor again. You can see the first file is root.log. For simplicity, for the purpose of this demonstration, we're just going to put it in the temp directory. Same thing with the pr.log, Predicate-Reducer log. And now we move to the next step. The next step is to set the path to the Predicate-Reducer in a couple of locations in an XML file. We can see it here. Okay, and the next step is to edit a properties file, but the defaults in the properties file are fine. We don't really need to edit that at all. And finally, it says we need to ensure that the concept mapping XML files are consistent with the concept mappings in the probabilistic predicate. And this can be done by following the instructions in the DS2 data scripts directory under configure OpenCDS Predicate-Reducer concepts. So let's go take a look at that. Scroll down to that section, and here it is. It tells us that we need to download to the data subdirectory required NLM SNOMED CT data files as described in NLM SNOMED CT data below. And what that tells us is that we need to have a free UTS Technology Services license from NLM in order to download those files. So we're going to do that, and we're going to place these three files in the data subdirectory, and we're going to do that offline because it requires a separate account. So we'll pause the video, put those files in the proper place, and then resume. Okay, we've accessed those files from NLM, and we have placed them in the proper location. Let's go take a look. There we go. We can see the SNOMED CT core subset and the two ICD-9 to SNOMED mapping files are all there. Let's go back to the instructions. Back to Predicate-Reducer. We're now at the build step. So we're going to go ahead into the right directory. and we're going to run the build. Oh, wait a second. We forgot one thing. We were down here at configuring OpenCDS predicate reducer concepts. We got the 3 files that we needed to do, but we forgot to actually run the concept generation step. So let's do that. We're going to go back into DS2 data scripts. We're going to run, now that we have the files in the proper place, it says we need to edit the script first in order to set a path. So we're going to do that. There's our path right here, the usual path to DS2. We're going to replace that with the proper path. We're going to save it. And now we're going to run it. Okay. We do get some warnings related to certain SNOMED CT codes, but that's normal. It's to be expected. So now we can go back to our predicate reducer and we can do the build. Now we're doing the Maven clean and install. As always, Maven is going out. It's getting all of its own prerequisites and all of the DS2 predicate reducer dependencies. There are quite a few of them, so it takes a little bit of time. While that's happening, we can go back to the website and get ready for our next step. At the bottom of the predicate reducer build instructions, we can see that the web services WSDL, the web service description language spec, will be available from a URL once we have it installed. But in order to get it to that URL, we have to install the WAR file to the appropriate deployment directory of the web application server. We can see that the build step was successful, and so now we need to copy the WAR file. So there's the WAR file. We're going to copy that into the auto deployment directory of our Glassfish server that we installed in the previous video. And that usually takes a minute. So if we look in the auto deployment directory, we can see that earlier we installed the simple predicate reducer visualizer. Now we've installed the OpenCDS decision support service, and it has not yet deployed. It is still not yet deployed, but we'll get ready for it. We're going to again take the IP address. We're going to visit that address in our web browser on port 8080. Glassfish is still running. Now we're going to check again to see if it's deployed. Sure enough, we can see that it has deployed. So let's try to get the WSDL. It says that the WSDL would be available at this URL. And there it is. So we have successfully deployed the predicate reducer web service, and now we need to move on to the next step. Going back to downloads and installation, we've been working here in the CCD redaction via web service. We just installed the predicate reducer, and so now we need to install the CDA web service. Scrolling down here. So the CDA redaction web service instructions can be accessed here. And that can be done built from source. And the instructions are very similar to all of the other DS2 projects. We start with the version control step. We're going to go back into our top level DS2 directory. We're going to run the version control step. We're going to go into the directory. We have a configuration file to edit. It says that we should check to see if OpenCDS is enabled, if that's indeed what we want, which is yes. And we should check the endpoint address for the OpenCDS web service, which we just installed. And we can see here that it's pretty close. It's almost exactly the same, but it needs to be port 8080 instead of the default there that was 18080. Localhost is fine. You don't need to specify the IP address if it's running on the local same host. So that's all we're going to change there. And now we can build it. Maven is going to do its usual thing and compile the project. And then we're going to install the deployment file back into Glassfish once that's done. You can see it's running its tests. While that's finishing up, we'll take a look at what it says about installing. Pretty straightforward. We just copy it into the auto deploy directory, and we have a URL for the WSDL, which we'll be testing momentarily. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and take that EAR file from the target directory, and we're going to copy it into the usual Glassfish auto deployment directory. Now that that's done, we're going to test to see that the WSDL works. We'll just use the same browser window we were using before with a different URL. Sure enough, there it is, the WSDL of the CDA redaction web service. Okay, back to the instructions. We now need to install the WAR file for this is for the web application, the CDA Predicate-Reducer web app. Let's take a look and see what it says about that. Okay, we've already built it, but we do need to create a properties file in order to set the destination of the CDA web service that we just installed. So we're going to edit this file here. We need to replace Glassfish Home with the Glassfish Home directory. And we're going to just paste it right in and then modify it as needed. Oops, I just made a mistake. We'll try that again. There we go. So the CDA web service we know is at localhost port 8080. Looks good. And now we just need to copy the WAR file. We know the WAR file comes from here. And we're going to copy it into auto deploy. We're going to check the auto deployment directory to see if everything has deployed. Sure enough, everything has deployed. Let's look at it from a different perspective here. There we go. So we can see the simple Predicate-Reducer visualizer was deployed earlier as part of the earlier video. We have the CDA Predicate-Reducer web service deployed, the CDA Predicate-Reducer web app deployed, and the OpenCDS predicate reducer deployed. So now it's time to test it. On the installation page, it tells us what the URL is. Pretty simple, CDA WS Web. I'm going to use that same browser window to access that application. And there it is. So what are we looking at here? This is the Predicate Reducer web app. It allows us to choose one or more conditions, pre-configured conditions that can be redacted. The user can choose a CCD file to upload, and then once the file is uploaded, the application is going to parse it and produce some diagnostic output in terms of validating the CDA document. It's then going to convert it to a VMR. That's what we call the CDS input, because it's the input to the OpenCDS engine. And then the VMR is going to come back from the OpenCDS as an annotated VMR. That's what we call the CDS output. The annotations indicate the segmentation that's been done. And then finally, that is going to be used to redact the original CCD. And then for the purposes of the ILHI prototype, this application also generates a consent document based on these sort of simple predefined conditions specified up here at the top. Now, where to get a sample CCD? Well, there are a number of places on the web to get sample CCDs. You can construct one, fabricate one yourself. You can download one from any number of sources, but the Bitbucket repository for our Sharps DS2 does contain some samples down here in the CDA web service. In the source, we can see here under CDA web service support, I believe there are some samples. Here we go. Support XML. We have a samples directory with a whole variety of samples that can be used, including one called CCD1 that we've already downloaded onto our local desktop here. So we're going to use that. So let's start fresh here and upload one of the sample CCDs. We can see lots of diagnostic output. This is not uncommon. The typical sample CCD has all kinds of minor violations of the spec. This is the VMR that's been created based on that input CCD. This is the output from OpenCDS, which is an annotated VMR. And finally, the original CCD comes back, and this here is our redacted CCD. This is the original CCD that was uploaded with redactions based on the annotated VMR that came back from OpenCDS. And here's the consent document, very simple, just based on the classifications or the conditions that were selected here, these predefined conditions. And that's the application. So it's a very simple web-based front end to the CDA redaction web service, which in turn utilizes the predicate reducer. And going back to the map here, the project map, you can see the relationships here. So we're using the web application, which talks to the web service, which uses the predicate reducer, which in turn uses the probabilistic predicates. And that concludes this video.